Thanks, Janet. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I always enjoy being back in North Carolina, and Raleigh's kind of like home. I lived in Wilson for 25 years. I have had the pleasure of speaking to this forum a couple of times over the years. It's always an important group in terms of public policy. Before I talk about innovation, though, I want to tell you a little bit about Cato because it'll give you a little context on what I'm going to say about innovation. Will be a little different perspective than you just heard. Cato is the world's leading libertarian think tank. Our mission is to create a free and prosperous society based on the principles of individual liberty, free markets, limited government, and peace. We believe the government should stay out of your pocketbook, but we also believe it should stay out of your bedroom. We think government has one role, a very important role, but a very limited role. The purpose of government is to protect individual rights. It's to keep me from using force or fraud to take what you've earned, and to keep you from using force or fraud to take what I have earned. In that regard, we think government has three primary purposes. One, a strong military to protect us from the bad guys overseas, an effective police force to protect us from the bad guys in our neighborhood, and a really effective court system to settle legitimate disputes so we don't have to resort to violence. In our world, there'd be 90% less regulations and far more effective courts. The reason we think that government needs to be limited is because government has a special power. They are the only people authorized to initiate the use of force. They have a gun, and people with guns and money can be very dangerous, very dangerous. In fact, throughout history, next to old age and disease, governments have killed more people than any other source. So it's a very dangerous entity. In addition, we believe in this in your own personal experiences. We believe that voluntary relationships are the foundation for successful civil societies. Anytime force, anytime government shows up, you're going to, by definition, have a suboptimal outcome because it is about the use of force where voluntary relationships always result in better outcomes. With that context, let me talk about innovation. If you think about it, all human progress, by definition, is based on innovation. Because unless somebody does something better, there can be no progress. And anything better will be different. And innovators are the ultimate independent thinkers. What makes innovation possible? In kind of a fundamental conceptual sense, it's the human mind. All innovations come from the human mind. In fact, there's only one real natural resource, that is the human mind. 500 years ago, oil was useless to human beings. Today, oil is useless to a bear. 35 years ago, telecommunications went through big, expensive cables made out of copper. Today, they go through fiber optics or through the air. Telecommunications were invented by human minds. And then the real question is, what makes human minds productive, innovative, and creative? We believe there are three pillars that underlie the productivity, the innovative capacity of human minds. One is knowledge. You have to know how to do something. The second is capital, the machines and tools that leverage human productivity. And finally is incentives. Let's talk a little bit about each one of these foundational concepts that make humans productive. Knowledge in the broadest context comes from education in the broadest context. Therefore, educational systems are very important. And the quality and effectiveness of education matters a lot. Interestingly enough, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, most people believe that education is important. The question is, how do we optimize our educational performance? And are we optimizing our educational performance today? Well, Cato does a lot of research in this area. We have interesting statistics. You can go to our website that looks at the inflation-adjusted expenditures per pupil in the United States, which have gone up exponentially since 1970, and the outcomes. And basically, despite the fact that we have exponentially increased our investment, the outcomes are flat. In North Carolina, we're very fortunate to have a great university system. And a lot of the reason Research Triangle is here is because we have a great university system. And interesting enough, by the way, universities compete for students. It's actually a competitive environment. If you look at our K through 12 education system, it's mediocre. And it's mediocre in a mediocre system. So it's really not very exciting. And if you look objectively at the victims of not so successful K through 12 education system, they're low-income kids and minorities. And despite lots of talk about fixing that problem, the problem continues. In fact, I think it's getting worse. I think one of our global challenges and why we're struggling with middle-class incomes is our education, our government-run education system is not teaching students how to critically think. And the only skill that matters in today's world is critical thinking, because technology changes by the time you learn the technology, so you have to be a critical thinker. Why would our education system not produce a satisfactory outcome, or at least not the optimal outcome? I would argue because it's the nature of a government bureaucracy. It acts like a government bureaucracy. First thing, it's trying to do something impossible. It's trying to serve everybody. Can you imagine mixing Walmart and Neiman Marcus together? It wouldn't work. And that's one of the problems with the education. The second, it has some pretty destructive incentives in the sense that in business, when we don't do well, when we don't innovate, when we don't be creative, bad things happen to us. In fact, business people, we talk about innovation. We don't actually like to innovate. We have to, or we won't stay in business. We get penalized by the markets. What happens to educational establishments when they don't do very well? Interestingly enough, they get more resources. Washington, D.C. school system is a classic example of that, where the per capita expenditures per pupil are the highest in the U.S. and the outcomes are worse. And the worse they do, the more money they get. You've got an inverted incentive curve. You know, I was very involved at one time in trying to fix the government-run schools. Maybe this is too skeptical on my part. I don't think it can be fixed it can be improved, but fixed in the sense of really transforming the game. I think to transform the game, you have to change the incentive system. And the way you do that is you subsidize students and parents and not schools. You do that with tax credits, you do that with vouchers, and I think if you did it seriously, you'd get a revolution. Because what that would do would be create competition, which would create innovation. And people look at the current private schools and say, well, they're not that much better than public schools. They probably aren't. But a lot of those private schools wouldn't make it in that market. I am very confident it would be a very different game. You would have a Bill Gates or a Sam Walton or a Steve Jobs or a Jim Goodnight who would change the game. What if those geniuses had gone into education in a true market economy, and instead of doing things that are nice from a technology perspective, had really focused their minds and energy on education? I think we'd have a revolutionary change in education. And if you want to improve innovation in North Carolina, in the world, there it is. And by the way, it's going to happen anyway. The technology is driving this change, and it would be very good to be ahead of the curve. The second pillar of human productivity is capital. It's the machines, the tools, the equipment, the computers, the computer type of software that makes human beings more productive. If our task is to move 100 tons of dirt and I have a front end loader and you have a shovel, I'm going to beat you. And I'm going to do it with a lot less effort and energy than you do. Human productivity is magnified by capital, by the tools. What's interesting, a lot of liberal economists like to contrast it as capital versus labor. Absolutely not. Capital is created by labor, by mental labor. First, somebody has to choose to save. Somebody has to choose not to eat the seed corn so they can plant next year's crop. And then secondly, mental activity. Innovation creates capital. Look at SAS or Microsoft or Amazon. All these companies were started with a little bit of money, and they had innovative capital created by human minds. So capital and labor are one and the same. It's just mental labor that produces capital. Where does capital go? It goes to where it's rewarded. A, where there's a good education system. B, where there's less regulations. And C, where there are lower taxes. So if you want more capital, raise innovation and productivity, have a good education system, less regulation, and lower taxes. The third pillar of the productivity of the human mind is the incentive system. And incentives are very important. Those of you that run businesses know incentives matter. In fact, I would say the one thing in economics that economists across the spectrum, from liberal to conservative, are agreed on is that incentives matter. Incentives matter. Incentives change behavior. Now, incentives are broad-based ideas. They can be money, they can be psychological, or they can be cultural. This panel earlier was talking about the significance of cultural incentives. People like to be in tolerant places. They like to be in places where they're accepted. They like to be in places that have art and education, all those kind of things. So incentives matter, and there's a large variety of incentives. If you want to talk about a really bad incentive system, think of socialism. The concept underlying socialism is from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That means if you're able, you get to work real hard, and if you're needy, you get a lot. That incents the wrong behavior. Free markets, the free enterprise system, has a different incentive. from each according to his productivity to each according to his productivity. So you're rewarded for being productive, and then the resources goes to those that know how to use them the best because they are the most productive. And they also, it's a merciless system. If you don't do well, you get driven out of business. The top 100 companies in America, there's only 2 or 3 of them that were the top 100 companies 50 years ago. It's a merciless system in a productive sense of the word. Now, interestingly enough, government regulations can be very disincentive. I happened to be in Silicon Valley a couple weeks ago meeting with a guy named Don Valentine, who started Sequoia Capital. He's in his 80s. And Sequoia Capital really started Silicon Valley, which is, by the way, largely a private enterprise. And in the conversation, Don said something that surprised me. He said, well, you know, we've had phenomenal returns, and we've chosen never to invest in biotechnology. I said, why is that? He says, the government's too involved in it. And I looked back and looked at some statistics. Although we've certainly had some innovation in biotechnology, compared to other areas, the innovation has been much slower and dramatically more expensive. I mean, look at the cost of new drugs. And why is that? It's the FDA. And the FDA has what you would exactly expect from a government bureaucracy and public choice theory, is they're a risk minimizer, right? If you're in the FDA and you approve a drug that, you don't approve a drug for years, and several 100,000 people have a shorter life than they would have had, who knows? On the other hand, if you approve a drug, and even though it benefits 1 million people, but 1,000 people die, the papers are going to jump on those 1,000 people. So the FDA is a risk minimizer, and they have a crazy standard for innovation. Everything has to be better than's out there. What does better mean? Most innovations actually start with things that aren't as good. Cell phones were nowhere near as good as landlines when they were innovated. In addition, a huge percent, that would never have been approved by the FDA, by the way. A huge set of innovations are simply cheaper. And they're not as good, but they're cheaper. They're cheaper. The FDA would never improve those innovations. So biotechnology lags behind other innovations because of the regulatory structure. And by the way, in many areas, there's less regulation in China than there is in the United States, which is a competitive disadvantage we have. And I have to say something about this because I was the longest serving CEO in the United States. The government, in fact, created the housing bubble. I saw it. They had $2 trillion in subprime mortgages in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, government-sponsored enterprises. So they did try to allocate and direct the economy in the name of affordable housing, and that's often the outcome of regulatory structures. You know, the real incentive, however, is liberty. It's free. As a libertarian, a classical liberal, that's what we talk about. We believe that liberty is essential for physical well-being in the economic sense, but equally important, maybe more important, essential for spiritual well-being. In the economic sense, in order to be productive, in order to be innovative, you must be able to think for yourself. If somebody keeps you from pursuing your truth, you can't be thoughtful. You can't really think. Lots of government rules and regulations make people act like 2 + 2 is 5. And you can't think if you're forced to act like 2 + 2 is 5. In addition, as mentioned earlier, all human progress by definition is based on innovation, based on creativity. Unless somebody does something better, there can be no progress. Innovation and creativity is only possible to an independent thinker. Somebody that thinks like the crowd cannot be innovative, cannot be creative, cannot contribute to human progress. That's why entrepreneurs are so important. Entrepreneurs take the ideas of scientists and engineers and turn them into reality. Without entrepreneurship, there's literally no progress. And what characterizes entrepreneurs? What makes them different? They are experimenters. They pursue ideas that most people reject, and they fail a lot. For every Google, there's 1,000 failed Googles. For every Walmart, there's 1,000 failed Walmarts. What the public government school system lacks is that kind of experimentation, that kind of failure, learn, and grow kind of process. And that's what free markets allow. And you have to be free to experiment, to innovate, to create human progress. We published a book last year called Poverty and Progress. It looked at human well-being from time immemorial. It's a very interesting insight. From the time Homo sapiens evolved 250,000 years ago until the late 1700s, human life expectancy was the same. some improvement in the quality of life, but life expectancy was the same. Then in the late 1700s, something happened. And it transformed the quality of life, first in Western civilization and now the rest of the world. There was an invention in the late 1700s, more important than fire, more important than the wheel. It was the invention of the rule of law, of individual rights, of free markets, of capitalism. Capitalism was invented and it transformed the quality of life. Because when people are free to pursue their own truths, to experiment, to innovate, to learn, to grow, they're radically more productive. So economic freedom is essential for economic well-being. We've got a website at Cato called Human Progress, looks at well-being on this earth, which, by the way, is improving pretty radically, and it's all correlated with economic freedom. Equally important, and maybe more important, freedom, liberty is essential for spiritual well-being in the context of the pursuit of happiness. And when I'm talking about happiness, I'm not talking about having a good time on Friday night, although it's good to have a good time on Friday night. I'm talking about happiness in the Aristotelian sense of a life well lived. Blood, sweat, and tears happiness. When you're 80 years old, you can look back and say, man, that was tough, and I'm glad I did it. And if you think about that kind of happiness, it has to be earned. You can't be entitled to be happy. You have to earn happiness. You have to set goals for yourself. You have to strive to achieve those goals based on your beliefs and your values as a free and independent person. Being free doesn't guarantee you'll be happy, but if you're not free, you can't be happy because you can't live life on your own terms. One last thought about the pursuit of happiness. The foundation for real happiness is real self-esteem, not the kind of fake self-esteem they talk a lot about, but real self-esteem. And it's interesting to reflect on self-esteem. It's a complex subject, but a couple thoughts. First, self-esteem is fundamentally self-confidence in your ability to live and be successful given the facts of reality. So you earn self-esteem by how you live your life. Nobody can give you self-esteem. You can't give anybody self-esteem. You can't give your children self-esteem. Self-esteem is earned. Live your life with integrity. That's why integrity matters. Raise your self-esteem. Second thought about self-esteem, for everybody in this room and the vast majority of people on this planet, the single biggest source of self-esteem is your work. And I use work in the broadest context, raising children, very difficult, very important work. However you define your work, it drives your self-esteem because you just spend a disproportionate amount of time, effort, and energy at work. That's what makes work important. Something I said to the employees of BB&T many times over the year. You know, it's important to BB&T that you do your job well, but it's far, far more important to you. It might fool me about how well you do your job, might fool your boss, but you'll never fool you. If you don't do your work the best you can do it, give them your level of skill, give them your level of knowledge, you can't do the impossible. But if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Now here's the good news. The flip is also true. Do your work the best you can possibly do it. Give them your level of skill, give them your level of knowledge, and you will raise your self-esteem, which is more important than whether you get more money or a promotion, because it's about your character. And interestingly enough, there's a huge, I believe, social implication to that. Take an immigrant that comes to the United States and tries to open up a small business. He has to open it up in a tough regulatory environment where there are a lot of rules, like the Tesla thing that was mentioned, and he struggles hard to get that business going. And maybe it never gets tremendously financially successful, but somehow he and his wife raise their children successfully. Maybe his granddaughter becomes CEO of a publicly traded company, maybe not. He has a tough, hard life. My granddad had that kind of life. He has a tough, hard life, but he gets something very precious from his work. He gets to be proud of himself. He gets to have self-esteem. Create an environment where that individual can innovate, where he can't start a small business. And you force him into a position where he has to accept welfare. Maybe he has more money, but he loses something precious. He loses his self-esteem. He loses his pride. There's a lot of discussion in Washington today about security. It's a false discussion because what they want to be secure from are the laws of economics and the laws of reality. And it's hard to be secure from the laws of reality. But even if it was on the right subject, that's not what the United States is about. We care about security, but this is not the land of security. People didn't get on a boat and come to Jamestown to be secure. The United States is the land of opportunity. The opportunity to be great, the opportunity to fail and start again, but most importantly, the opportunity that small business owner, that construction worker, to live life on their own terms as a free and independent person, to pursue their personal happiness based on their values, their beliefs. That's why people came to America. That's what created the most entrepreneurial, most innovative society in the history of man. And that is the American sense of life, which is very precious to protect. Thank you very much.
Janet, as I make my way to the podium, I'm going to ask you to weigh in and talk a little bit about the kind of innovation policies you see as most important for investments in North Carolina.
Yeah. I want to come back to what I alluded to earlier, which is this: if we want more money invested in venture capital, how could the North Carolina state government be helpful in that? The pension is a conservative investment profile, so 25% in venture capital in that innovation fund is sort of the maximum that I think is appropriate for the pension. But there is another pot of money that is circumscribed and discrete, and it's the lost property fund, the Sheets fund. And that has in the past been used like an endowment, and the interest earnings went for scholarships, do go for scholarships. However, starting in 2004, we started drawing down some of that money and using the corpus to pay for scholarships. So not just the interest earnings, but the corpus. When that happened, the Treasurer's Office, myself, who manages that money, who invests it, had to liquidate some of our long-term and put that into more liquid short-term investments with a lower return, because I couldn't be assured that money was going to be there. That's where I say we need the buy-in from the General Assembly and the governor has spoken about this recently and his interest in providing more venture capital funds for the state. So what we would need to do is fund only scholarships through the interest earnings, and to the extent that that doesn't meet the full scholarship need, find another source of funds for that so that we can protect and put a firewall around the Sheets Fund and use it for longer term investing. So that's what we are seeking. I will be talking to the General Assembly about that. And again, I know the governor is very interested in that concept as well.
Many thanks. So just so that you all know, I'm getting questions by cue card. I'm getting them on my iPad here, and I'm also getting them on my phone. And we have more questions for these panelists than it would take a semester to answer. So, in the interest of trying to make sure that you get something to eat before next week, Friday, I'm going to just ask 3 questions. I'm going to direct them to one of you, please. And forgive me, I'm going to do the best that I can to try to categorize your question, even if I don't ask it verbatim, okay? So let me start with you, Bob, if I can. The private sector has been shown to underinvest in basic research because of time horizons in business. You made reference to that in your remarks. Thus, few companies are able to really capture the benefits from fundamental research on their own. At the same time, government standards for innovation lay a strong foundation for future innovation. A number of people want to better understand your perspective here and whether your answer to this question depends on the type of industry. So when you think about the government's role, the question really is, does it differ from industry to industry? And can you give us some examples?
Well, I think on this point I might agree with my colleague John. I don't know that government knows enough to say the optimal externality is 72% in biotech, 42% in IT, and 85% in clean energy. So we're going to have special tax credits, or that's just too complicated, and I don't think we know. I think what we do know is generally R&D activities by companies do produce big spillovers. Now, that's actually why President Reagan was a big supporter of the research and development tax credit that was created in 1981 and put in place in 1983. His team understood this core point, that there is market failure when you don't have prices aligned. The same reason you have market failure around pollution. Companies can pollute, but they don't, and they impose a negative cost. So the short answer is, I think what we need to do is really 2 big things. One, we need to beef up the R&D tax credit. It's nowhere near good enough. It's essentially a lower level, if you will, in some ways than it was 15 years ago because of Treasury interpretations. We've proposed increasing it from 14% to 20%, and at least doing that. But really what we need to do is get it up to about 30 or 35%. Second thing we've proposed is a collaborative R&D credit. This is what about 10 countries around the world now do. California does this as a state. Companies that fund research at NC State or at UNC or whatever would, under this new collaborative credit, get a bigger credit. So I think that's the one area we do know there's a difference on as a general rule. When companies are funding extramural research at a university, at a federal lab, they get even fewer of those benefits because they can't capture all of the IP and all of the innovation. And yet, it's that collaborative research, our companies working collaboratively with universities and federal labs, that's a big, big driver of innovation. So that's why we've proposed, and there's actually a collaborative R&D credit for energy research that we helped put in place in the 2006 Energy Act. So that would be one thing. I think the other thing would be we just have to increase federal support for science again. NIH budgets, we talked about biotech, but NIH budgets are down about 30% from the peak of doubling when you look at it as in inflation-adjusted dollars. NSF funding is more or less stagnant. You know, if we're going to regain our lead, we've got to do both of those key things.
Terrific. John, I've got a number of questions for you that really surround the global context in which our work takes place. So how do you respond to the fact that other countries are heavily subsidizing particular industries that are in competition here in the U.S.?
I'm an advocate of free trade. In fact, we've got a bunch of statistics. If you wanted to improve the standard of living on the planet, the easiest thing you could do would be eliminate all trade barriers, because then resources would flow to the most productive uses. I think for countries to subsidize industries in general is a very bad mistake. That doesn't mean that every once in a while they won't get lucky, but because there's not a great history of governments, I mean, we can go back to the Soviet Union or North Korea, however you want to pick, doing a great job of selecting what to invest in. Why would you think they would do a particularly good job of investing in it? Usually they invest in the past. The curves left them, and they're 1 inch behind the curve. So I don't worry about subsidized industries in the rest of the world. I believe free trade would raise the standard of living. I believe that people only trade because they're better off. In fact, in our statistics on human progress, after economic freedom, free trade comes next on the list. I personally don't worry about the Chinese. I don't think they're really a problem for us. I think we're our own problems. So I think global cooperation based on trade leads to a higher standard of living for everybody.
Let me stick with you for a second, if I might, John. We have more local government officials in this audience than I can remember in any recent forum, and we have a number of questions that really surround the larger meta of what advice would you give to a local government? We've spent a lot of time talking what nations are doing, what states are doing, but what can local communities do to invest in innovation?
Well, that's a great question. I think that first, you can have relatively low taxes. Secondly, to the degree that you can encourage competition in your educational system, local voucher systems, I don't know what the rules are in every community. I believe you would get way ahead of the curve, and particularly focus them on low-income kids and minority students where the systems in general are not being very successful. I would be very cautious about using an eminent domain. I've seen so many local projects that fail. There's some success stories in that regard, but taking the power of government to take somebody's property that doesn't want to sell it, to build a school is one thing. To subsidize an industry, I don't think is a very healthy status. So, and of course, maintaining physical budgets, maintaining cost control, and being healthy physically, I think is very important for local governments.
Thank you. Bob, can I ask you to respond to the same question, please?
Sure. I mean, I think the key is you don't want to be stupid. You don't want to waste money. So I agree in that sense, but I don't think low costs. I don't think there's any evidence that low costs drive in knowledge hubs or innovation hubs. The most expensive innovation hub in the United States is Silicon Valley, and it is dominant in the world. I mean, it is so far above everybody else, and yet it costs an enormous amount of money to be there. California regulations are not, shall we say, all that user-friendly. So I think what the key for local government should be, I agree with John. Actually, I am a supporter of school vouchers, and maybe we should get together on that, because I think school choice, we've got to do a lot better job of that, and local governments could do more there. But I also think that one key thing we hear a lot about is how can we get innovation? Well, by being innovative. And I know you, for example, have Cree here, an LED company. Well, you go to Copenhagen, they have the world's leading LED demonstration facility in Copenhagen. Companies from all over the world are coming, putting their LED lights on the city, street lights and other things like that as a test bed. Why can't a North Carolina community do that? Why can't North Carolina communities be the test bed for intelligent transportation system innovations, energy innovations? There's a whole suite of things like that that government can play a role of, and it would help improve the quality of life and improve the delivery of government services, but at the same time, it would send a message that you're friendly towards innovators.
Thank you. Well, let me ask you to join me in thanking this really thoughtful panel. Bob is going to be out signing books at lunch, so you'll have a chance to go ask him some of the many questions now on my iPad. And John will be with us through lunch also, is that right? So feel free to ask him questions. In addition, John is going to have some books sent here. They'll get here tomorrow, and we'll be distributing them to everyone who wants a copy. We'll have them out on the book signing table for you, hopefully by mid-morning